bottom. Okay, perfect. Okay. So good morning. My name is Rene Gonzalez. I am an Ifa priest and Shango devotee, consecrated in Marianao, Cuba in 2011. I am Puerto Rican, though. I'm not from Cuba. Previous to that, I had undergone the ceremony to become a sworn drummer in Añá, juramentado en Añá, in 2010. The story of how I got involved in this faith, the story of how I got involved in this faith is unusual, considering that both my parents and my extended family from Puerto Rico were raised Christians. My extended family were mostly devout Catholics on my father's side. On my mother's side, we had a sprinkling of Protestants, Methodists, Baptists, and some Catholics. There was no exposure to this faith in my early childhood, save a very rare occurrence when I was in my teenage years and I accompanied my father to a radio station in Puerto Rico. My father is a well-known musician from Puerto Rico and was promoting a series of concerts on the island at the time. And I remember that we had sat down waiting for our turn to be called into the studio, and there were these two people who were dressed completely in white with these very weird necklaces on. And the woman was a regular white Puerto Rican woman with a turban on. And I just found it so odd because in my upbringing in Puerto Rico and in the USA at the time, I had not had any exposure to persons who were practitioners of African traditional religions. I remember I asked my father about it because it was so weird, and he kind of made a dismissive tone comment. Esos son santeros. Those are santeros. And I didn't understand what the hell were santeros, nor did it intrigue me or motivate me to explore my faith anymore. So, in fact, my parents were both products of the 1970s political agitation in Puerto Rico. They were both relatively active members of the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, and they were pro-independence. So, my father's this man over here. Me parezco exactamente a él. Yeah, I'm his clone, he says. And then this is my mother, Selma Berrio. So, they were both musicians and singers and guitarists. This is my father over here. And my mother, when they were working together in Ráfaga, one of the groups there. Now, my father was a founding member of many of the most important Nueva Trova groups in Puerto Rico. My father remembers going to rehearsals with Andrés Jiménez when he had come out from his construction work, so his pants were all stained with cement. He wasn't the famous person that he is now. My father also worked as the musical director of the famous balladist Danny Rivera for many years and had at least 3 of the albums arranged by my father. As well, my father remembers working with Antonio Cabembale. We actually had a concert with him, the composer of Verde Luz and other important songs. And when Roy Brown had begun his career, my father, Jose, was there, particularly for the creation of probably his most important work, Distancias, which is an album that wedded the poetry of Don Juan Antonio Corregel with the Nueva Trova compositions of Roy Brown, Jose Gonzalez, and Miguel Cubanos. You can see there were the 3 artists involved in the project. Now, my mother, she was educated in psychology and later received a master's and doctoral degree from Smith College in social work. My mom grew to be very resistant to organized religions because of her experience in her family upbringing. It was a very strict Christian household from El Campo, countryside of Puerto Rico. But we'll get to her development later in life because it gets interesting. So I was born into a family of 2 intellectual leftist independentistas who generally had a view of the supernatural that could possibly better be described as agnostic. Both of my parents would tell me things like, tienes que rezarle a Papito Dios when I was a child, but there was no organized religious practice in the household. The person who had the organized religion aspect in the household was mi abuela, Maria, here in the middle. Then my grandmother from my father's side, she was a devout Catholic and would make me and my brother and I bend the knee next to bed and pray before we went to sleep. And I thought it all boring, to be honest with you. She would take me to Catholic misas and my brother and I would get antsy. And of course we get to the reprimand, shh, from abuela and from Titinolmi, who would go with us. But my mother in particular was worried about our religious upbringing and would complain to my father that she wasn't too hot on my grandparents taking me to Catholic Mass because we would get confused. And the reason for that is she wanted to raise us Baptists. So sometimes there was, things that were not the same between Baptist and Catholic. But we also went to a Baptist church, and I remember taking Bible classes. So, funny enough, I learned a lot of biblical knowledge from that and never practiced it afterwards. But generally speaking, my parents were products of the times, the 1980s. They were people who questioned. They were people who thought critically about organized religions and their inconsistencies. They thought more openly about spirituality and likely had met friends who were from other faiths. So my brother and I grew up in a household that didn't emphasize too greatly religious practice. It was there on the perimeter because of the extended family and because Puerto Rican society is largely Catholic. So whether you like it or not, you're going to get your heavy dose of Christianity. But there was no exposure to African faiths, and generally, if there was anything I learned from my parents, it wasn't to be fanatical or fundamentalist. It was to be more relaxed and open-minded about faith practice. This is an upbringing. This is why I make this whole hoopla about my life. This is an upbringing that contrasts greatly from a Cuban or a Venezuelan who may have lived his or her entire life in the religion. My experience was not like that. So when I get to my adolescent years, I began to search. My father had books about history and politics and biographies. My father inculcated in me a desire to know about history by making us watch National Geographic documentaries on TV. So we'd get a healthy dose of World War II history stuff because my father loved war history documentaries. I grew up reading about political leaders, Albizu Campos, later other revolutionary leaders from other countries, Ho Chi Minh, Mao Zedong, obviously Fidel, which unfortunately has been a disappointment because when I was young, I was idealistic and ignorant of the realities of the dictatorial nature of a lot of these regimes. I was aware that the USA had an imperial reality, which is true, and we're living in the most fascist period of USA history. So my view was colored greatly by what I perceived as the abuses of the USA with my nation, Puerto Rico. But it took some trips to Cuba to realize that the Leninist ideal wasn't the solution to the Latin American problems. That for another thing. I have a master's degree in political science, but today we're not here for that conversation. Okay? So, let's see. So, when I was in college, I was kind of a free-flowing, happy-go-lucky guy. My world at the time was music. I had been a professional musician practically all of my teenage years. I didn't like religious fanatics. Christian fundamentalist students would accost me entering the campus center at UMass, asking me if I had time for them to speak to me about my Savior, Jesus Christ. And I was like, nope, no thank you very much. And I literally would laugh at them. I was irreverent. I was non-caring about faith traditions, beyond the desire to understand the basic structures of people's worldviews. I was interested in culture and traditions, and in a tangential way, maybe some basic principles of their religion. I remember that when I was in college, when 9/11 happened, I was in the middle of my master's degree study, and that provoked an interest to study Islam and why the Muslims hated us. And I read the entire Quran and realized that the same God in the Bible was the same God in the Quran. And I couldn't understand why people were fighting against each other when they believed in the same God. These things didn't compute for me. So this is me, getting the graduation. So flash forward. I'm sorry, let me go back to the past one here. The one thing I did realize along those years is that I had an interest in the esoteric. Something about the magical nature of witchcraft or casting spells was intriguing to me. By the 7th grade, I had read the Tolkien books. So I was deep into that nerd, goblin, and elf stuff. I wonder why I didn't have a girlfriend until I was 19. But I remember there was a Haitian man that worked in one of the offices. And I didn't, really know anything about his practice, but he once intimated me some spiritual information. He took me aside and said, hey, I need to talk to you because you have an ancestor who wants to say this. And he was right. That was the first time I said, how does he know this? That type of stuff. So it was an Asian man. I've never seen him ever again. I've tried to track him down and I haven't been able to find him. So he was a voodoo practitioner, and I didn't really know anything about that beyond, unfortunately, and forgive me, images in my head of skulls and blood and weird dark rituals. But his messages from the other world intrigued me. That was the first time I was exposed to the idea that the world of the ancestors can speak to us, that it wasn't just a one-way street of prayers and not hearing them. Okay. Flash forward 10 years, and I'm playing regularly in a Latin jazz group in Hartford, Connecticut with a man named Victor Papo Sterling. Papo had been a member of the Tito Puente Ensemble, and I traveled Europe with him. Papo was also one of the first Puerto Rican Homo Añá, Before Papo and two others, there had never been any Puerto Ricans who had been sworn to the drums. But I found that out a lot later. We were just musicians playing in the same group, and I was intrigued with learning Bata rhythms so I could apply them to my drum set playing. So I asked Papo to teach me, and he refused me nicely. Renecito, you're a drummer. Esa es tu línea. You know, that's your mission. These rhythms, these are religious. This is more for religion. He didn't want to teach me, okay, because I was not in the faith. But I kept haranguing him. And after some time, Papo, who was a very cultured man and educated man, he is a Freemason, a Rosa Cruz, a member of a large Spiritist family from Puerto Rico, and a practicing member of the Ifa Lukumi faith. His family is actually pretty well known. Those who know Awilda Sterling, the dancer, is his sister. And his mother, very famous for having written, I believe, one of the more famous cookbooks, de Puerto Rico. So the Sterlings are an extremely, very well-known family in Puerto Rico. So he decided to give me a chance. He told me, Rene, I'm going to give you a book. I want you to read it and tell me about it the next time we speak. So I handed him a book. He hands me a book by Allan Kardec, which has nothing to do with Ifa. But I think Papa was testing my interest in the spiritual world. He gave me The Gospel According to Spiritism, which to this day remains one of my favorite books because I consider it to be the most explanatory books available about the real messages of Jesus Christ and the gospel. If you read the Bible, it's all in parables and you have to interpret. But with the Allan Kardec book, you were getting the interpretation of what Jesus meant directly from the source, from the spirits themselves. That was a mind-blowing spiritual awakening for me. For the first time, the meaning behind Jesus' actions made complete sense because the explanations from the spirits were logical, not fanatical or fundamentalist. The next time we were on a trip to a gig to New York City, I spoke openly about the book's ideas and tenets, and Papa was impressed that I had assimilated the material, so he offered to teach me the first three Añá rhythms. El Eguán, Ogún, y Ochosi, but nothing more. He said, hasta ahí porque tú no estás jurado. You're not initiated, etc. So he just taught me the first three. That began my path toward Ifa. Within a year, I had done Guerreros and Mano de Orumila ceremonies. In the Mano de Orumila, it was determined that I was a Shango devotee. No surprise there, considering that Shango is the owner of the drums and music. And that's what I was, a drummer and a musician. But also a path toward Ifa practice. My life sign determined in that ceremony indicated much ceremonial and Ifa work. And in fact, my Ifa sign is Obeate. Obeate is one of the, in my opinion, that's going to sound, self-beneficial. One of the best 10 signs of the 256 signs, highly associated with Ifa practice. Because it's in my sign that it talks about the priest converting Iyorosum, the sacred powder of the faith, into money and to working and worshiping the Orisha. So if there was a person that was more designed to be in this faith, it's me. And yet, I don't come from that background. It's interesting how even when you come from a different culture, practice has nothing to do with that. If your soul comes to this earth to do this work, it does not matter. It will find its way to its practice. And I've seen things that are weirder than that. But I'm giving you this background so you say, how the heck did that blanquito with that pava end up in this particular faith? You know, that's a question even my parents ask me. They still ask me about that. Okay, so enter the first trip to Cuba. In 2011, I went 6 months afterward of the Mano de Orula to consecrate, and I was very excited about the trip. It was the first time after 20, 30 years of doing all that revolutionary reading, I was visiting La Revolución, this idyllic revolutionary society where Fidel had courageously established a society in rebeldia, in defiance. And then I met the reality. Broken down buildings, skinny people, people in drabby clothes, people with a very natural happiness and tropical personality, but also people who always seemed very resigned to their lot. When you ask them, you know, ¿y qué está pasando? Esta es la revolución. Aquí no cambia nada, mano. Esta es revolución. Everybody was just resigned to their lot. However, their religion was everything. I was completely immersed in the world of Ifa. I began to see things I had not seen before. Tablero de Ifa, polvo, animals being sacrificed, goats bleeding in the other room, drummers playing oro seco to the orishas, which I don't know if we're going to hear that later today, but I thought we were going to hear the bata playing. And the conversations, though they were about secular issues, always had a seasoning of Ifa Orisha commentary. All conversations always included some mention of the spirits, the orishas, and the religious lifestyle as being integral to the daily living life of the practitioner. So it wasn't something separate. This was their life. The political, the social, the sexual, the musical, the artistic, it was all wedded together with the religious. There wasn't something separate. And that's also very integral to African faith in general and African cultures in general. So, given Cuba's poverty, most of them essentially only worked religion because they could make more money catering to us Yumas. That's the way they refer to us, the foreigners from the USA. Some of them were cordial and friendly and have remained friends for years. But that was my first hit of knowing that some people were also there for the money to be made in the ceremonies. And that is, unfortunately, that is a reality that we're seeing with African traditional religions all throughout. Whether we see it in Voodoo and Benin and Togo and Ghana, I'm assuming maybe in Haiti as well as coming out with catering to Western initiates, and Cuba también. The religious tourism, unfortunately, has, made it difficult to strike that balance between authenticity and paying the cost that really do go after these ceremonies, doing them. But anyway, vamos a ver aquí. Where did I leave off? But thankfully so, I was not swindled. That happens as well. It does happen in my faith. But people were doing their job. I cannot claim that I had the best ceremonial experience. Like other santeros seem to claim, I became sick with the water of Cuba, which is poison to outsiders. I spent my 7 days of consagración as a babalao, essentially with horrible stomach issues. No more details to begin, but you can imagine. But the experience was interesting, with a deep because when I underwent the ritual's 3 divination stages, all 3 divinations painted me as a person with a deep relevance as an Ifa priest, more than the music aspect that came out in the first sign, in the first divination, Mano de Rula. So, basically my mission on this earth was to work Ifa, and that's important. We'll get to that when we speak the issue of what's the purpose behind the ceremonies. But when you go through divination, you're supposed to find out what is your guide in this life. What are you supposed to be? Are you supposed to be an agricultural worker? Are you supposed to be a teacher? Are you supposed to be a healer, etc.? My Ifa work was to become, my sign, a musician and a babalao. More than anything a babalao. More than the music side, which is interesting. And you only figure this out with this divination. And this, to talk about, this is me. Ali, are you here? Right. You are here. I know you're looking at me. No, you didn't. Yes, I did. These type of pictures are very rare. You will not find them because there's a very secretive tradition that I think comes from the reality that this religion was persecuted by the Spaniards and persecuted by the early Cuban Republic, and even the Communist Republic also persecuted. So people developed a tradition of secretismo, of hermetism with this religion, of not showing this. This is particularly common whether you go in Nigeria and they're doing an Idoshu or a Yoko Ocha ceremony in Nigeria. It's common for them to show them in this type of clothing. You will not see this. Most people have never seen this picture, but I said, oh, you know what, I'll keep it for this audience. This is me consagrando en Chango when I was actually doing it. But that picture, I didn't know they were taking that picture of me. They took it there. And then this one is when I'm coming out to do the Ijorjes ceremony, coming out as an Ifa priest. This is my godfather, Eduardo Gonzalez, myself, in Cuba. And this is the few days before the initiations. They sat me down to play, and they said, tu tocas bata. So they sat me on the okonkolo, and I practiced with them, played a little. So here we go, continuing. Estos son bata drum, the ritual. I mean, this one in particular is an abericula, but this is basically the drums they used in the religion. Implements of the religion, Ifa divination tools, the okoles that are used. This is common in Nigeria, common in Benin, Togo, Ghana. They have divination of this sort. Los inquines, unfortunately, this is how it still looks, porque I did a sacrifice a long time ago, over 13 years ago, y así se quedó. It stayed like that. I never touched it again. And los inquines míos with their stuff. So these are some of the religious implements in my house. Old picture, very, very old picture. Okay, so my old also had a story about the shekere, the gourd-like percussion instrument that musicians use in guidos in the Afro-Cuban faith. And this story talked about a shekere that needed to perform a bo, or ritual offering, to be able to be known as a famous dancer. So naturally, if I was telling me that beyond being a babalao, I would also have a musical career. And voila, if I was not wrong, I have ended up being both an accomplished musician who has performed with many Grammy-winning artists and important figures of the Puerto Rican musical community. And also, I have grown to have the respect of my peers in the online Ifa community for my content on TikTok and YouTube, focusing on explaining this faith's tenets and theological positions from an academic, westernized perspective to facilitate it's understanding by people that don't know anything about this particular faith. The difficulty a lot of times with this faith is that you either will find people who are very westernized, academic, and know how to talk and explain to an audience, but they don't know nothing about the faith, or they know it very tangential. And then you will know people who have gotten in the nitty-gritty and know how to run these ceremonies, but they have no vocabulary, no English speaking, and they don't know how to construct this. So it's rare to get this particular balance. And since I know that it's rare, I've made it my point to do that job, to be that conduit of information, and to explain things that might seem esoteric and difficult to understand, even scary to some audience, and demystify them and explain them how does this work. Okay? So now, with that preamble, let's talk Ifa. Santeria or Ifa, the misunderstood faith. What is Ifa all about? Some would call Ifa a way of life. Others would call it a philosophy, a way of thinking. Others would call it a religion because it had a set of norms of conduct, religious ceremonies, or initiations, established deities, the orishas, ancestor worship, the spirits of our families and friends, and a conception of a creator, of an overarching God, which we call Olodumare. I would say it's all of this and more. Ifa for me is an explanation of the world, of the universe, of nature, of the energies that surround us, and the constant interplay between the human and the earth plane and the entities that live in Orun, the ancestral or heavenly plane of existence. The roots of Ifa, let me see. We'll leave that one for a second. The roots of Ifa are debated, though the simple explanation is that Ifa culture or worship stems mostly from the Yoruba people located in modern-day Nigeria. There are hot debates on the internet about this, regarding how much of what we have in Cuba and Ifa is also a mixture of other ethnic groups from Benin, Togo, and Ghana. In addition, the geomantic system of divination located in Nigeria shares very clear parentage with an earlier form of Arabic divination named Raum. Over 26, and we've done this, I'm in the forefront of that debate because I've gotten a lot of heat from it and others as well. But we've been able to find at least 27 anthropologists who have written on this and have concluded that Yoruba Ifa divination is a derivative of Arabic Raum divination. But I make the caveat. The Yoruba and the Fon people of Benin obviously expanded it and added their cultural, folkloric, and religious components to the divination structure. By 1518, there are Catholic writings in the Americas that detail African slaves from the Gulf of Benin performing divination in the Americas. And by 1830, the first Ifa priests began to arrive to Cuba. By 1880, Cuba was in the midst of its slavery emancipation, and unlike the other Latin American nations, Cuba's authorities allowed the newly freed Afro-Cubans to practice their faith practice within cabildos, or societies of mutual support. This was crucial for the protection and perpetuity of the faith. The practices, the ceremonies, the prayers, the chants, and everything about the Ifa Orisha faith were protected in those cabildos and later transmitted to the growing Santeria community. The protection was so well done that today there are legitimate debates with legitimate evidence that perhaps one of the oldest and most well-preserved variants of Ifa is the Lukumi, because unlike Nigeria and Benin, it did not suffer from a lack of a written language. They had Spanish. And the double cultural colonization of Muslims in 1500s to 1850 and British Christians from 1850 to 1960. The Cuban Ifa practice were protected and codified in Spanish in the cabildos of 1880. An important fact to note is that according to various anthropologists, most clearly J.Y.D. Peel in Nigeria, there was no organized overarching Ifa religion with Olodumare as the god and the Orishas as his angels or underlings below him. This has been discussed in the last 10 years. Funny enough, the first Ifa practice in the world to put together all the Orishas under the same roof and with Olodumare God on top was Cuban Lukumi Ifa. The necessity of bunching together in the context of slavery and post-slavery made it that disparate religious practices joined together under a similar theology. In Nigeria, prior to 1900 and possibly as late as 1960, the Orishas were deities worshipped separately in their own zones. So an Oshun practitioner would have nothing to do with a Shango practitioner. An Ogun practitioner would have nothing to do with an Obatala practitioner. The first to have that conception were the Afro-Cubans. This was important to the early development of the faith practice in the 20th century, as priests of many different faiths came together to initiate priests in each other's deities. That was unknown in Nigeria. In Cuba, it became the habitual practice. So, now, the idea that Babalaos were the top hierarchy in the faith was not a reality in all zones of Nigeria. There were zones like in Oyo, where the Chango devotees had nothing to do with Ifa practitioners. They ran their ceremonies independently. This has changed post-1960 in Nigeria, as the Ifa priesthood, possibly influenced by the Cuban experience, has garnered a preeminent position as the priesthood that most attention gets from the West. Okay, now let's talk about some of the cultures. The rest of it I'm going to explain over here. Un momentito. Okay, so what are the other names for the faith? La Regla Lucumí, La Regla de Ocha refers to the Orishas or Ochas or Orishas, Ifa, Ifa Afro-Cubano, Afro-Cuban Ifa, or the Orisha tradition or worship of the Orishas. What are the priesthoods in the faith? Well, we have actually an example here. We have an Orisha. So Santero Orisha were people who work with most Orishas, Ali here. Alejos would probably be everybody in this room that has not received the Yoko Ocha or any other ceremony of consecration that makes them a priest in the faith. That's most of the believers. There's people who are believers who have mano de rula, who have guerreros, who are to simply say, I believe in the Orishas, or come receive divination in the homes of an Ol Orisha. Or in the case, the higher rank is the Babalao, who work with all types of Orishas, but we are the only ones tasked with the obligation to work with the sacred implements of Orunmila and all the ceremonies that have to do with the Ifa divination. But the task and the faith are very shared. There's a lot of stuff that we do, and there's a lot of stuff that we don't do that a person like Ali would do, or Orishas would do, and we're not allowed to do. The Babalaos, that's more of a political division, because if you go into the Nigerian practice, the Babalao could technically do Ol Orisha work if they're initiated in their particular Orisha. But in Cuba, there was, I believe, a meeting between Mamon Serrate and I believe it was Tata Gaitán Undafung, and they essentially divided politically the task of the faith so that there would be peace between the houses, because there was a lot of complaints from the Ol Orishas that the Babalaos were taking over all the ceremonies. So in order to keep the peace, they came to a political agreement which has stayed to this end. It's become part of the tradition now that if you're a Babalao, you don't do certain things, and if you're an Orisha, you don't do certain things. Okay. This is a tablero de Ifa. This symbolizes the world, nature. The circular representation means continuity, and there's a word for that. It's never ending. If you see symbols in Nigeria, you will often see a snake eating its own tail as a symbol behind it, and that's represented in the circle. The idea that everything is continuing, that there is day and that there's night, that there's the earth plane, and supposedly there's a skull, that there's the ancestor world, the balance between the two things, and they're always intertwined and part of the same circle of life, okay? Male and female, white and black, that balance in nature that we also see in Buddhist traditions or in Taoist tradition with the Tao limit. The Tao is the same thing. When we just start looking at all these cultures from the world, you see the similarities between all the concepts of balance of nature, okay? Let's see. Why is it called Santeria? Well, necessity. The slaves had to cover up their worship under the guise of worshiping Catholic saint statues. The reality is, though the statues are sometimes employed by some believers, depend on the tradition of the house. Some houses have no statues or have already not used them anymore. The real icons of the faith are usually elements of nature, stones, shells, seeds, and other sacred items. The Catholic statues have absolutely no astral or sacred power. They are there for decoration. Some people will, have a devotion to them, but you can't do anything with a statue. You're not going to be cleaning anybody with a statue or initiating anybody with the statue. But they were there because this was the only way to hide it from the masters. They would have the religious objects, the actual icons, the stones and seeds, hidden away in losas or in a hole or behind the wall. But in front, if the Spanish masters would come in, what they would see is an altar to La Virgen María de las Mercedes, La Virgen de la Caridad, Santa Bárbara, etc. And they would say, that's really strange. ¿Qué especie de santería tan extraña tienen los esclavos? What a weird saint devotion the slaves have. But because it was Catholic saints, they thought, okay, anything that's Jesus, that's good. So they didn't have any idea that behind the wall, they had the real stones. They were Ochun or Yemaya, etc. What cultures contribute to faith? The Yoruba are the prime group. I have I have particular problems with the terminology, and I think the Yorubas as well, because it's a term that derives from derogatory terms from the House of Fulani, the ethnic group from the north. So it literally means the Yeriba. The House of Fulani would call the Yoruba the Yeriba, which means los listos, los mentirosos, los tramposos. It was basically saying the mischievous, the devious people, the ones that will swindle you. So even the terminology of Yoruba, I have a problematic association with this term because it's negative. But before this was created and imposed upon a whole bunch of different sub-Yoruba groups, the Yesa, the Ochogbo, the Oyo, the Ijebu, the Ekiti, etc., before they were Yoruba, they were all these groups, and this nomenclature was put upon them. And now it's some parts of the Yoruba people will say we don't consider ourselves Yoruba, and they call themselves Omo Oduduans, or the Oduduans as a term. And some will still continue because it's just become a catch-all term for everybody that is part of that western part of Nigeria. But for a long time, it was thought that it was always Yoruba, 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 until in the last 10, 15 years, when I initiated in 2011, there was a lot of debates because new video evidence and photographic evidence was coming out of Benin showcasing that a lot of our rituals in Cuba come from Benin practices. And I'm one of the head persons getting a lot of fire from this because there's some practitioners in our faith who are very Yoruba-centric and have moved on from the Cuban practice over to Isheshe practice. And they don't like people like me when I come and bring out evidence showcasing that a lot of our objects, a lot of our practice comes specifically from the Benin side, from the Fon people. Which means if we do the math together, we don't, as the Cuban practitioners, don't have to do things as the Yorubans do it in Isheshe, because our practice itself has a lot of influence from the Benin side. And this is being discovered as we see practitioners from Togo and from Ghana and from Benin coming out and doing videos on YouTube, on TikTok, on Facebook, demonstrating their practices. And when we see it, we go, coño, pero míralo ahí. Míralo ahí, this is ours. And for a long time, we've been told that we were wrong, that we were inventing, that we're not doing things as the pure Yoruba do it. No, we were doing like these guys. They came too, which is consistent with the slave practice. So this is important. That's why I included it over here. Sister practices. Palo Mayombe comes more from the Bikongo and the Bantu people. But in Cuba, everybody mixed together. So there's objects in practice in Ifa that are heavily influenced with some of the practice, the constructive ideas of the paleros, particularly the icon of Osain that we have in the Afro-Cuban Ifa practice. If you see an Osain, it's basically Gurumfinda from the Palo tradition. It's almost the same thing. The only thing that's added is some Ifa iconography inside. But there also is firmas, which would probably be similar to the Veves. In fact, I'm pretty much sure it's exactly the same thing. Just different names, but lo mismo. It's the pictography, the language of it. Okay? And then, important, European Spiritism, I think, developed or was incorporated into Ifa practice because the Egbe tradition from the Yoruba tradition, which is basically a cult of worship to a particular set of spiritual tribe, our ancestor guides, the fraternity heaven is what they're called. Basically, we all are members of a particular spiritual tribe in heaven. When we pass away, we will be welcomed by that spiritual tribe when we come back in our conception. But not enough, my theory is not enough priestess of Yoruba-style Egbe priestess arrived to Cuba to maintain the practice. But curiously, when you go to Nigeria, Yoruba Egbe priestess, mostly the cult is almost all governed by female priestess. And they're the ones that lead almost all the rituals. You have to have at least one female priestess in order to have it. That's one of those rare occurrences where it's not male-centric, it's female-centric. The Egbe priestess are female-centric. También de Gelede, but that particular practice did not arrive too much in Cuba. But why is it, or is it a coincidence, that in European spiritism or espiritismo de Cuba, females run it, and they're the most expert clairvoyants? There has to be something to that. Why is it that the females tend to have some of the most spirit connection more than the males, even though there are males that have it? But why is that? And I think that the connection to it is that when they came to Cuba, lacking the priest or lacking the structure of the Egbe priesthood, they found the next best thing. They saw Spiritist traditions as something akin or very similar to their practice and used Western European Catholic prayers and songs a la Virgen Maria and to Jesus Christ to essentially open the channel. So it looks ostensibly Christian, but when the board is open or when the table is open, the people who come out are the Egbe, are the spirits of the Egbe that are coming and speaking to the clairvoyants, que son espiritistas. Para mí, la espiritista de Cuba es un Egbe priestess, and vice versa, okay? I could be wrong, but I could be right. There's another way of saying no acepto being wrong. Okay, initiation levels. Now, receiving necklace is usually the first ceremony that many people do. If you come with a babalao, like for example, if somebody comes to me and says, Rene, I want to initiate, I don't perform this ceremony. We go straight to the warrior orishas, receiving the first 4 icons of Elegua, Ogun, Ochosi, and Osu. Usually, sometimes now it's very popular to mix it together with the Owofakan. This is really, for me, one of the most important ceremonies because that's when we determine what is the person's life mission. Are they here to work more secular work? Are they here to become a doctor? Are they here, for example, signs like Obarakana speak of prosperity. Ikabemi speaks of a merchants. Ochetrupon is a tallador, is a woodworking person. So the artists are divided. My mano de orula es Osalafobeyum, donde nacen los aparatos musicales, where the musical objects are born, and where the person has to, ahí nace también, the ceremonies that have to do with shaving the heads and stuff like that are ceremonies. So right away, from my mano de orula, I was being told, you will be initiating people. You will be working ceremonies. But I didn't see it back then. It took a while for it to happen. But this is a very important ceremony. Everybody has to go through it. And it's basically where people figure out, do they go here? Do they go here? Where else do they go in the religion? If they're told that they have to initiate as a priest because they have a function in this faith, that they're going to be birthing people and it's going to be important, healing people in the rest of their life, they go on to Yoko Ocha, which is, or Yoko Ocha, the Cariocha, or what popular is called making the saint, or hacer santo. And they're consecrated. This ceremony is done by an Olorisha. I cannot perform this ceremony. If somebody came to me and said, I want to become santero, and their sign, their life sign says it, I'd have to go somebody like Ali said, Ali, I got to talk to have somebody that wants to initiate. And she has to do her own divination work and figure out whether or not her house can accept her, whether or not her Orisha says, yeah. Because if it says no, that person's life path is not through her home, it's through another place. And we will be unaligning the person. So it has nothing to do with capricious or money or like that. It has to do with the fact that this is not the life destiny of that person. A responsible priest figures out what they got to do from here and asks the Orishas everything, every step of the way. Consecrating Fa, I forgot, becoming an Olorisha. We were having a talk about this, funny enough, earlier today about that. In Nigeria, there's divination verses that speak that neither homosexuals cannot be Olorisha or Babalao. So the question is, if it was the same slaves, why did this happen that in Cuba, the tradition developed that homosexual men and women could initiate in the faith in the Cuban side? One of those political situations or life situation, there was a santera, an Olorisha named Aurora Lamar, who I believe was a madame. I think her other work was a madame. She had a brothel. And this lady began initiating homosexuals, people who were shunned by Cuban society, prisoners, chulos, which were pimps, all types of negative people, unfortunately, in that community. But because she pushed it on the community, it became part of the rule. It was too late to go back. They had hundreds and 200s of santeros who did it, and then nobody could say, no puedo hacerlo, because this house was already doing it. So that's one of the reasons why now, to this day, now it's completely fine. There's no problem with anybody who's homosexual or heterosexual, men or women, to become Olorishas. But that's the reason. If you go to Nigeria, it's still a kind of a taboo issue, and they will not discuss it too much. Or they'll say, well, that's not an issue that we do. That's a Western concept. Like, we don't have homosexuals here at all, which is not right, but that's how they just basically don't discuss the issue. Y también, tristemente, money talks. And they look the other way when money, unfortunately, occurs. This is a reality. Yo hablo claro, aunque duela. 15 years in this. But anyway, consecrating Ifa, performed by Babalaos only. The heterosexual men are the ones that can come in, and only select few are identified by Rumila to do this. You don't choose to become a Babalao. Ifa chooses you. When I spoke to Angelito Poi, who has 65, 70 years of edad and 40 years of Ifa, he told me that when he had done Ifa in 1980s, nobody wanted to become a Babalao. You didn't just say you wanted to be a Babalao. The Babalaos chose you. If they saw a potential in you and they saw the ethics of it, they would take you to 16 other Babalaos who would examine you. They would examine your manhood. Querían saber if you were homosexual or not. ¿Y quién es tu novia? ¿Quién es tu esposa? They wanted to see if your behavior was good, if you were a criminal or not a criminal, that sort of things. Once they've all agreed with you, each of them would give you one seed, one Ifa seed. And when you had all 16 seeds, you had to go to 16 Babalaos diferentes, and there wasn't that many Babalaos at the time. In 1959 to 1960, there was only 200 babalaos in all of the island of Cuba. So 30 years later, todavía no había mucho. You had to go get approved by them, and then when you had the 16 seeds, your godfather would give you the last 5 seeds to do the ceremony. So there was a lot of fiscalización. Not everybody will get into this. Tristemente, that has, just like it's happened in Nigeria, it's happened in Cuba, it's become easier for pretty much anybody that brings money to be consecrated, which has its positive consequences. The community has engrandecido, but qualitatively, we've had people who are not supposed to be in this faith haciendo bobería and criminals que tienen IFA hecho. I mean, point blank, personas que son criminales. And, you know, that's a problematic for people like me who do not hang around with that kind of crowd. And then receiving additional ceremonies depending on what the divination says. Depending on what a ceremony para recibir yegua, I don't do that. I would go to an olorisha to do that. But if I had to do entregar, I don't know, an object of the IFA faith, orum or a sign, they come to me and I'm the one that has to construct it. Okay? I'm going as quickly as possible, and please ask me questions later, because I try to bunch up as much as I could in this. Other smaller ranks. Omoaña, priest and specialist of the bata drums. These are the men who, and they also have to be heterosexual. The Omoaña, on top of the fact, and this is from Nigeria too, meaning the women don't do it over there either, so it's not the Cuban invention. The men are the only, heterosexual men are the only ones allowed to be drummers. They tend to be, my reality, voy a hablar claro, they tend to be very, very strict on this issue of the heterosexuality, definitely. Y son medio machista. I mean, this is a community that is, you know, I love them to death, and they probably hate me for saying these type of things. I am a member de la fraternidad, de los bataleros. If you thought babalaos were stricter about these type of issues, estos tipos, you know, no le vengas con ningún chiste, because they don't run this way. Some of them are not very diplomatic. They'll look you in the cara, oye, hacer con esa, perdona mala palabra, que esa marico no me ven aquí. They're very strict about this. Pero, I got along with all of them. I'm a sworn drummer. I've never had trouble with them. Cool with them. They are the ones that are empowered to play these sacred drums to bring down the orishas to the earth. So they fulfill a very important musical collective function. Without the drummers, we don't have a collective gathering. One of the few times that we collectively gather in the Lukumi faith is when we do the drumming. So these men are important, and they're the only ones that know the liturgical language. They're specialists. They dedicate their entire life to learning those patterns, the songs, etc. And this is an Olorisha here at the end, probably one of the singers, Anakwong, a person who does the ritual singing. And then Osainistas are those that specialize in plants, people within the faith that specialize in learning the magical properties of all the plants. No, this plant is good for you for this. They're basically the herbalists. The herbalists of the faith are the Osainistas. A depiction of a Nigerian style of priest, the way they dress, the hats and stuff like that, you know. Why is Afro-Cuban or Lukufi Ifa different than Nigerian lineages? We talked a little bit about it earlier. Various regions contribute to Afro-Cuban Ifa, mostly Nigeria and Benin, but likely other smaller ethnic groups in West Africa. Cabildos mix together free slaves from different Nigerian, Benin, and other zones, leading to a unified new geomantic faith practice. There's controversy, debates about ancestrality and originality versus new evangelization for Nigeria. There has been a lot of claims, I've participated in as well, that some of the stuff that is written in modern Nigerian writings about what is Isese seems suspiciously close to Rosacruz, Espiritista, Hindu, Buddhist, and other tradition. And there's a question about how much of that is actually truthfully ancestral. Because when we go back and we look at the Afro-Cuban practice and voodoo from Benin, when we actually visit Benin, there's a lot of stuff that seems to suggest that the Afro-Cuban focus is more original in that sense, because it's remained, I don't want to use the word stagnant or fossilized, but it's remained shielded from these other sources. You're not going to get very deep investigation and cross-pollination of religious theological viewpoints from a practicing Ifa priest, because their focus will be on what was taught to them from their elders, and then from their elders and their elders, and they're very strict on maintaining things as they are. That has a positive and a negative consequence. Negative consequence meaning that they're not very open-minded sometimes. The positive consequence is that they protect the actual practices to as ancestral and original as they were. And this has exploded on the web because those that are of this side, ancestral and original Lukumi, have criticized the Nigerians of inventing new traditional practices to make it palatable to the Western audience and to add feminist viewpoints that they believe were not original or ancestral. So these conflicts are at the forefront of a lot of gender, a lot of LGBT, a lot of racial struggles that are debated, hot debates on the internet, okay? But that's why it's different, because they will look at the Afro-Cubans and say, you guys are too machista or too strict, like I say, and the Afro-Cubans say, no, you guys deviated from what the ancestral and the original was. And these debates se pelean, okay? That's why there's some differences. What is the meaning of life in Ifa theology? In other faiths, Abrahamic faiths, the meaning of life is largely to do good and to worship the Abrahamic God, Yahweh, Allah, as the sole God. In Ifa, the meaning of life is to fulfill the destiny that one chose before God, before coming to the earth, in the most aligned and beneficial process. So, yes, we worship the Orishas and the spirits, but más importante is one Ori, or one's internal deity, or one's mission. Otherwise, why are we here? And that's the outlook for the African in that sense, or the Ifa practitioner, mejor dicho. What is divination? The Ifa faith distinguishes itself from some of the more common faiths. I'm talking about the bigger ones, not other African faiths, because almost all the African faiths have some form of divination. But the Buddhist, or I don't know, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, etc. Okay, somebody can make the argument that the Kabbalah and the Sufi Muslims do have divination. Y los Rosacruces también in Christianity. But most popular Abrahamic faith practice, it distinguishes itself by the divination. 3 forms of major divination. Obi divination, which is used by either coconut, or in the Nigerian context, the obi kola, which is a kola nut, and it opens up into 4 lobes. So they designed the divination system with 5 letters or 5 explanations that can be expanded upon. Then there is Kauri, or Erin Dilogun, or Dilogun divination, which has up to 16 letters in the Nigerian context. In Afro-Cuba, they doubled it up with 2 castes, so now it's 256 odus. Depending on the Oriate. Some will read only 16, and some will actually read 256. And then Ifa divination, which has a combination of 256 different signs, which have to be memorized. Also, clairvoyance, we talked about it earlier, through Egbe priestess in Nigeria or spiritist in the Lukumi. So all of these are forms of divinations that are common in the Afro-Cuban tradition. Communication with Ifa is considered supreme and more detailed because only Orunmila saw the creation of the universe alongside Olodumare. So this is also a hotly contested statement. Even making that gets me a ruffle feathers with the Olorishas. But the argument is that when certain problems are too difficult to solve, it is believed that certain entities of nature that may be negative, such as Elenini, infortune, Eshu, which is a deity that balances nature but can be good, can be bad, Iku, death, Iyami, the witches, the Yami Oshoronga, they're deities that only Orunmila, according to the lore, the mythological lore, only Orunmila pacted with them. And therefore, when a person suffers certain problems and the casting of the caracoles is 13, 14, 15, 16, it is a sign to the diviner of the caracoles that their problem is so severe only a Babalao can intercede on the matter. Not because the Babalao is machista or because he's so special or he's better than the Santero. The Santero could probably know more than them. The Babalao has a pact and energy transfer from Orunmila when they consecrate that allows them to work as a representative of Orunmila. And when they do their ebbo or their rituals, at the moment these deities that I'm mentioning se apartan. They go behind because they have to respect the pact that they have with Orunmila. So that's why when certain problems are so severe, a Santero will say, me cayó 13-14, I got to send you over to Abalao. It has nothing to do with arrogance. It has to do with energy pacts and the relationship between the deities and the human being who is a Babalao. How do we do that? Ebo, method of ritual sacrifice, a very important concept of balance that we always have to when we do a divination. Even if it's just talking to the deity or putting a glass of water or a candle, there must be an exchange done. Just like when we're in nature, if I'm going to come here, a plane ticket had to be bought, a hotel had to be rented, a salary or a payment has to be done, or a person has to exchange something because otherwise I am losing in the interaction. So I win something, and you as an audience is winning in through the exchange. That's a concept, and there's energy involved in that. So it has nothing to do with capriciousness. It has to do with energy and the balance of energy. Olorisha doing Dilogun divination, a Babalao doing Okwele divination in Nigeria, and a Babalao doing Ikim divination, which is thought to be more deeper in reading. A little bit longer to do, but when there's a big problem, they go to a Babalao and do Ikim divination. Okay? Ikim is seeds. They do a casting. They'll have 21 seeds, or 16 seeds actually, when you take out 5. 16 seeds, and if they have 2 in the hand, they mark a 1. It's a binary system. If they grab and they have 1 in the hand, they mark a 2. And it's basically the idea that Rumila speaks at random. You have no idea what's going to happen because you try to grab as many as you can, and then you mark, okay? So, and it doesn't fail. That's what's, to this day, is the most amazing thing for me. I'm a fan of the divination side of it, because you just grab a bunch of seeds, and I look at a person and said, you have a problem with your husband. Y él tiene esto, 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 and I've seen women start crying in front of me, and all I have to do is, Orunmila never fails. I have blind faith in this because it's 15 years of he's never failed me. So why am I going to, not believe him? Okay, what type of divinations are there? Temporary and regular divination. Regular divination is performed to ascertain solutions to problems or receive guidance on regular affairs. We are energy doctors or astral doctors or spiritual doctors. That's the way I see us Babalaos. To the point that I believe that we should be paid just like any other doctor, because there's people who have come to my house who have been in hospitales. I'm not lying, this is completely true, and I'm sure Ali has stories similar to that have come to me and have said, Mira, I have somebody in the hospital, they're in a coma or whatever, and I've done it, Bo, and within 12 hours the person has come out from their coma or come out of the hospital, and the doctors cannot explain it. Ese es el poder of Ifa. And it goes to the issue that the colleague explained to me, the idea that physical disease is also explained by spiritual imbalances or the energy field, the aura. This is already known by Western science. They call it the aura, but that's what it is. The Chinese call it chi energy. The Indians call it the chakra points and the alineación of chakra points. The Japanese call it Reiki energy. We are bioelectrical beings. We have bioenergy, and that bioenergy is connected to the other side, to the ancestral realm. That is the way we connect to it. And the Western world now is starting to figure out and giving it, what's the word? Acceptability. Now it's okay. We can all now be energy workers. We can all now accept it. We can all now accept acupuncture. Yeah, they've done this for thousands of years, and the Africans have known this también. All the Asian cultures, if you research back, will find out that they already started explaining the idea of energy and the balance between the earth plane and the ancestral plane, no matter what name we call it. So that's what divination is for, is to diagnose your moment in time and your energy as it is, and what in it is out of alignment that's causing a matrimonial problem, a money problem, a job problem, a health problem, an enemy, attracting an enemy, and what do you have to correct it so that the balance of energy pushes away the enemy, pushes the disease away, pushes the lack of prosperity. That's all it is. It's finding that balance. Life divination. These occur in major ceremonies like the Mano Durula, Yoko Ocha, or a Babalao's consecration. These describe the life destiny, tendencies, problems of the person, the benefits of their sign, what are they going to be good at, and the solutions of a person's entire life. If my sign, yo soy epiléptico, I haven't had a seizure since I did Shango and Ifa. Mafere, fue un Shango and Ifa that cured me from that disease. I had it all the way since I was early childhood, and I don't have any more seizures. But in my sign, it talks about the story of the battle between the brain and the cerebellum, when they were both fighting for control of the body. And while they were fighting for control of the body, what was happening to the body of the people on the earth? They were having convulsions. How did I divine with the seeds a particular sign that had no idea? And then the Babalao started speaking to me and telling me, do you have a neurological condition? How did they know that? And how were they able to solve it with the medicines that were applied there? Because they diagnosed the problem. So the solutions of a person's entire life are contained in their Odu. This is why it's important to do these initiations and get the information there, okay? So when people are lost or they have a medical condition, it won't always cure, but many times it will reduce it. And I'm not going to name anybody here in the room porque no lo quiero poner on the spot, but there's somebody in this room that had a heavy medical condition, and he did his ceremonies, and his conditions heavily improved to the point that what you see right now, you wouldn't imagine what he had, what he described he had before. That's the power of these ceremonies and all African traditional religions, in my opinion. Okay, how do people solve the problems? Divination works under the concept that one listens to the warning of the deity being consulted, whether it be Elegua with the Dilogun or Ifa. They follow their Ewo, taboo, and that also, taboo are followed, and behavior changes, the conduct are done, and a person must perform for the correct ritual Ebo for the situation. These things is important because people ask, how come, I went to a Babalao or Santero and I didn't have a solution to the problem? You need to have all three. You need to perform the ritual Ebo that will balance out the energies or use the symbolic energy of the object in your favor in a particular ritual. That's important, but that's 50% of the problem. The other 50% is you are told to get away from a marriage that is abusive from it. The man that's with you is abusive. You're told you should leave this man. You don't leave him, you're going to continue getting hit. you're going to continue in a bad situation. If you're told that you're not supposed to marry, funalbe, marry men in uniform, police, military men, and you do, and then you end up in a domestic abuse situation, you were told never to marry a man in uniform. Not because men in uniform are inherently wrong, but because men in uniform may be put through a particular behavior modification. They're trained to be martial, follow orders, not think, and be aggressive and as toxic and as lethal as possible in their work. Therefore, when you bring that to your household, what are you bringing into your household? A potentially dangerous person. Not everybody who marries a military man is going to get into that situation, but if you're a woman with a funalbe, no, tú no. Don't get married with her because you're violating the ewo. This is important. And a lot of people stumbled with the ewo. And then the behavior changes. If you're told that you're too capricious. I had a story of a woman who came to my house and I did divination. I saw osarete. And I asked her about her life, and she told me she had a wonderful life. She had a wonderful husband. She had children. She had money. Very pretty, attractive Cuban white woman. She got all the men she could want. She had everything in life. So what's your problem? Because sometimes I wish my husband would say no to me. Because every time that she would go out or do something like that, the husband would, okay, honey, no problem, let's do that. He was very, accommodating to that. And the sign of Sarete said that the biggest problem in the person's life is that the person is discontent and they need to stop being discontent. There you go. What's the behavior conduct? Appreciate your husband. Appreciate your life. Appreciate the money. Appreciate the child. And don't be so discontent in your life. But if you don't change that way, you'll continue saying malagradecida. And therefore, you didn't apply the conduct de Bo. You didn't apply from the Bo, you're going to still have the negative problem in la vida. That's how IFA works. Identifying the behavior patterns of a person that are harming them, identifying the energy stuff that is not working for them, and the ewo that they need to not follow. Babalawo Orisha must be trained enough to memorize as much information about an Odu as possible. Each Odu in the Afro-Cuban tradition probably has 15 to 30 stories, and there's 256 Odu. Multiply it. We're talking about over 5,000 or 6,000 stories, each with a particular, ¿cómo se dice? Medicina. No Babalao knows them all. Some Babalaos will know great from one sign, like a sign like, I don't know, Osaka, I might know 4 stories of that. Iretemeya, I know a lot. Porque my wife is Iretemey, so I had to figure out who the heck I was marrying. I know your secrets. She can't hide from me. And I bother because her sign says la vanidad y el capricho pierden la persona. And I go, está siendo vanidosa. And she goes, ay, cállate, René. I love my wife. So, the last thing I was going to say, there's an ethical code that exists. People say that Ifa doesn't have an ethical code. There's 256 ethical codes in the Afro-Cuban tradition. Obeate siempre hace algo por las mujeres. Always does something for women. I have to always help women. Sí o sí. Me gusta o no. Okay? That ethical exists there. ¿Qué otro más? Trying to think of another one. Oturaroso, hale bien y no mires a quién. Oturanico, el que hace bien a montones, recibe bien a montones. So even if constantly tells you, and I did a video about this issue. We're going to get political on this one. I did a video about this issue online because most people don't study the ethical code. And I was particularly peeved with Afro-Cuban Babalao practitioners who support this MAGA movement. And I said, you are violating the ethical code of Ifa. And I went for 2 hours and a half showcasing it. I'm YouTube. You guys can look for it. The ethical code of Ifa, as I explained it. Going Odu by Odu, Oyogbe, Obeyekun, Obewori, Obedi, Oberoso, going one by one saying, in this sign you can't do this. And Donald Trump did that. And this guy, Stephen Miller, did that. And this guy did that. So you're supporting the violation of this ethical code. And I went uno, por dos, por tres, y por cuatro, por cinco. So when it comes to the issue of the symposium of spirituality as resistance, our ethical code obligates us to be good and to reject what we're saying right. We don't have a choice in this matter, even if we were politically against it. Our ethical code of Ifa does not support abusing of other people, which is pretty much the guiding principle of this regime. Y ahí me quito con la política. That's as much as I can do. Porque no me quiero molestar a nadie más. All right. We have Olodumare over here, the God, depiction of God, Obatala, the white or the white cloth pure deity. Orumila, the divination deity. And Odudua, sometimes she's presented as a female form, but in the Afro-Cuban tradition, it's almost always considered more as a male form. In reality, Odudua is amorphous. The idea of Odua is an eye with a cloud around it. That's how people who have seen Odua or claim to see spiritually see them. They see them as a big well, probably the eye of providence, lo que sea, un ojo, amorphous. So he's not either male or female. It's a higher entity. Okay? Breakdown of our view of creation. We have Olodumare, the one God above everybody else. Orishas, deities made by God to govern different aspects of this creation. They are directly tasked to relate to human beings as human beings relate with nature. Each has their own province of nature governed. Yemaya, the close waters of the sea. In the Nigerian tradition, it's a river deity, but in the Afro-Cuban tradition, it's a sea deity. Olokun owns the sea. Ochun owns the rivers. Agayu, the volcanoes. Elegua, the four corners. Each of them has a particular province of nature to govern. The Egungun are under the Orishas, on a plane of existence under them. The ancestor spirits, human who once lived and have passed away, spirits are thought to be especially beneficial because they are closer to our realm and more concerned with our affairs. The same thing happens, I would assume, and I'm going to speak from particular experience because también tengo 21 divisiones, so I have some voodoo experience. When Anaisa or a particular lady comes out, she has to take care of everybody who is an Anaisa devotee. But my particular spirits come to work with me. They're tasked with me. And therefore, sometimes they work faster than the actual entities here. Even though you can work spiritual work with them, sometimes these guys solve your problems better because they're not worried about anybody else in the world. Rene needs help. I'm going to help him. Yeah, ahora. As fast as possible. Okay? And that actually has worked. I've seen my wife in moments of anger go to her particular artist and say, oye, me pones a trabajar esto aquí. Con esto, o si no, yo no te atiendo. Within 3 hours, the problem is solved with another person. And that happened particularly when a man killed a member of our family in Puerto Rico. He strangled a woman, sadly. Was a member of the family because of the stupidest situation. She didn't want to have sexual relations with him. This is the part that angers people. And la mató en Puerto Rico. That was a very, very famous news in Puerto Rico. El carro lo encontraron en un barranco. But my wife got so angry, she went to her altar, to her cosa de palo y cosa de esto. And said, si usted no me buscan este matón ahora. Within 5 or 6 hours, they found the guy and he confessed to the crime. And we knew, nobody else knew, as we knew at home, se pusieron a trabajar because my wife never asked them for anything. But she said, this you do or I don't attend to you guys anymore. Within 6 hours, they found the guy. And then, of course, the living. We are the condemned. We are the condemned right now. I mean, some people call it condemned, some people call it different things, but we are the ones living the terrestrial plane because if we're here, we're impure spirits. Anybody living in this plane is behind. Nosotros somos atrasados. If you read anything Alan Kardec, you'll know that there's different planes of existence or different planets or of existence. The Earth is a plane of existence, not the worst, but we're still in a trial and tribulation stage. So we are the ones living through the trials and tribulations, the betrayals, the sadness, the diseases, everything that we have to learn from so that one day we can escalate over to the Egungun side. And if we're completely enough reincarnations of purity, one day we become an Orisha. Okay? Just images, Omoanya, Babala working, and a Babala of the Afro-Cuban tradition, and a Babala of the Nigerian tradition, but they're both working essentially with the same thing, trays, you see? The same system, just different clothing and objects and implements. And Omoanya playing with an Orisha. Controversial topics, my favorite. So we're going to deep dive into this one. And con esto yo creo que vamos a terminar. How much time do I have left? Anybody know? We're done? Okay, pues nos fuimos. This is it, okay? My apologies. Yo hablo mucho. Animal sacrifice. Why do we do it? Concept of nature's 3 main categories. Mineral, plant, and animal world. Energy from all 3. Where do we get the energy on Earth? The sun. The sun is considered Olorum for us, which is the owner Orum of heaven. Heaven is the ancestral plane. The owner of the ancestral plane gives us sustenance through photosynthesis, the plant world, the chlorophyll. So we have matter energy, we have chlorophyll, and hemoglobin. The energy in all of these different parts of creation are to be found in these 3 substances. We need all 3 to be able to transfer the energy of the energy world or the ancestral world onto our terrestrial plane. If we wanted to be able to charge any object or consecrate a person, we need a boost of that energy, of a combination of the mineral, plant, and animal world in order to make a miraculous change for the person. So think of it as whenever we do animal sacrifice or we wash an object in ceremonial plant-based herbal remedies, we are plugging the person to the wall and giving them the electrical energy for them to work. Without that, this wouldn't work. The lights wouldn't work. None of this would work. Same thing with humans. You can't change a human's reality, whether it be disease or otherwise, without, in some way, sometimes including the animal world. You don't always need this one. This is last resort. When you don't, you can solve a lot of the problems with this part. 90% of the problems can be solved with this. And I'm a big believer in stopping wanton animal sacrifice. But when we do need it for consecrations, this is the reason. It's not because we like to kill animals. We need the hemoglobin, the energy that curses, the bioelectrical energy, spiritually speaking. Brujeria, which I hate the term, but we got to talk about it. It's energy manipulation, incantation, focus petition, amplification of petition through ritual use of symbolic objects. So let's take the classic example in popular culture of the voodoo doll, which we also have. We have muñeca, etc. What you do to the doll, what you insert in it, or what you le pegas a eso is what determines the effect of the magic. The magic itself is neutral or inert. If you take a doll and you smear it in honey and you smear it in positive things, you're going to attract good things, sweet things to the person. If you stick a lot of coins and money to the thing, you're bringing prosperity to the person. But conversely, if I do an obra donde pongo mierda de perro callejero, y gato callejero, and vinegar, and lemon juice in it, and ground dirt from a burnt home, and ground glass from an accident, and all those things together, and I do a ritual, what am I asking to happen to this person? Accident and everything. This doesn't mean that we babalaos or olorishas are innately evil. We have the capacity, just like any other human being, any other religious tradition, to manipulate energy, which is the energy of nature, to our purposes. But there is a price to be paid. If you do negativity, the Indians know this concept, karma. What you do to others comes back to you threefold, which is why the intelligent babalao or olorisha doesn't do this without permission of the deities, and only when we're under attack or somebody's harming us in our life. Because if we do it wantonly without permission of the deities, until the deities say, that person has done a lot of wrong to you, I give you permission. If you do it, you're going to be the one to pay for it. But this, I wanted to make issue of this issue, mention of this issue, because this is one of the most controversial, these two, that make people get scared with our particular faith practice. And the reality is Christians can do it. The Psalms, the Sufis, Muslims can do it. The Kabbalistic Jewish people can do it. The Hindus definitely do it. The Buddhists pueden hacerlo. We are not alone in this. It's just that unfortunately we've been maligned. African cultures have been maligned by the prevailing white authorities all across time as being dark magic all the time. And there's a lot of focus on the negative, but there's no focus on all the positive. And I would say 90% of the work that we do is diagnosis and application of medicine, which is witchcraft. It is a witchcraft, but it's a positive witchcraft. So what I wanted people to know is it has nothing to do with dark force, etc. We are manipulating energy through incantation, focused petition, and the amplification of that petition through the ritual use of symbolic objects, the concept of sympathetic magic. I wanted to break this down in a westernized way. Finalmente, negative spirits, yes, they can be directed, yes, they can be comprado, but again, if you do something bad with a particular spirit that didn't ask permission to be used for that purpose, he's coming back to you, and you're going to get it back después. Any questions? We'll have to do it later. I think we're going to be doing a lunch break now and then a question panel. And I believe you guys wanted to have people see the gallery, if I'm correct, right? Gracias. All right. Vamos con los papelitos y me fui.